Hey, I'm Mr. Ghost. If you love true horror stories, consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. The stories you'll hear are shared by our audience from Reddit, and to keep their original essence, I read them exactly as they were written. Before we begin, let me know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? Now, let's dive into the darkness. I had moved to lovely Brookertown, New Hampshire. It's about an hour from everywhere. As I followed the U-Hauls to my new lair, I noticed how desolate and alone the highway felt. Was I even on the highway anymore? I had not seen a car besides the truck in at least 20 minutes. I was zipping by giant foliage, trees as green as the Jolly Green's pecker. Occasionally there would be a dirt road, or a rundown driveway sprinkled into it. But mostly I was surrounded by a massive forest. If I don't sound thrilled about this move, it's because I wasn't. My brother had recently passed away, and I was now the only one able to take care of our ailing grandfather. Grandpappy had lived in Concord all his life. Up till his eyesight started to fail, we decided to relocate him a nursing home before he accidentally ran a kid over. He flat out refused, and somehow managed to relocate himself to this middle-of-nowhere hillbilly town. My brother lived an hour away at the time, and decided to move in with the old fart. Keep an eye on him. This was 5 years ago. I had not heard from him since. We were never really that close, so it's no real surprise. But when I finally got word of him, that he was dead, I admit my heart sank. So many things I should have said but didn't. I was also surprised to learn my now 92-year-old grandfather was alive and kicking. He had requested that after the funeral, I come down and spend some quality time with him. I knew what this really entailed. I had read my brother's will after all. So, I quit my job and moved to fantastic Brookertown. God, what an awful name. Eventually, I limped into sight of my grandfather's cabin. It looked like something out of R.F. Stein. It was at least 3 stories. A chipped red paint stained the exterior of the house. The front porch was rotten, barely held up by 3. Count 'em. 3 cinder block support beams. There was even an old-fashioned weather vane on top of the roof. The perfect little lighting rod in the shape of a rooster. I was awestruck at the state of this fire trap. My brother lived here for 5 years. Richie was always the sort of man to live well above his means, and he settled for this crap shack. Pappy Roberts must have brainwashed him. That must be it, I thought to myself. I parked just behind the U-Hauls and exited my car wad of 20s in my hand. The moving guys had already begun to move boxes out and into the house. I could hear yelling with a suspicious southern drawl coming from in the house. The voice was threatening to blast the intruders with his bazooka. At the time, my grandfather's impossibly Cajun accent was the strangest thing about him. I had no idea why he put it on. He had lived in the North all his life. We were Italian, for God's sake. In any case, the movers were ignoring the incredulous bastard. Probably dealt with things like that all the time. I saw the driver smoking a cig up near the truck, and rushed over to shake his hands and thank him and his guys. He took the money and, with a little smirk in his eyes, said, "Your grandpappy don't really have a bazooka, do he?" He said in a mock accent more fake than my grandfather's. "Not since the FDA raided the place," I remarked. This got a laugh out of the guy as the whistle to his men to run on out of there. They had really worked fast, as the dust cleared as they sped away from this condemned miss. I hear the tap-tap-tap of my grandfather's cane on the porch. I turned around and saw him. As a kid, I always thought Pappy was 15 feet tall, and had a beard black as coal, and smelled like it as well. The man in front of me now completely assassinated my childhood idol. He was hunched over, barely supporting himself on his cane. His beard was patchy, unkempt, his hair snow white, and his head covered in liver spots. He wore the same eyeglasses he had when he was a kid. Those dorky-looking turtle glasses. He was probably blind as 3 bats. Yet I could feel his cataract blues boring into my soul. "Boy, I know I told you to call before coming up here. I'm an old man. Those men breaking in here like that, I could have keeled over. I could have..." Pappy Roberts roared at me. I sighed internally, and walked up the dirt path to the house to greet him. I couldn't help but notice how decayed and full of crabgrass the front yard was. I did call Pappy. You said you didn't care, and you would probably be dead by the time I got here. I eyed him up and down. Did you die, Pappy? I immediately regretted that snark, as I felt the lighting fast warp of Pappy's cane against my shin. Ah, how I had missed that. Now, don't you be getting smart with me, boy. You get smart with me again. You can sleep out here with the Windies, he remarked, turning his back to me and hobbling back inside. I noted that he was wearing lumberjack overalls and the classic red and black patterned shirt to go with it. I followed him inside and expected to see the place a hoarder's wet dream. Imagine, to my genuine shock, that the place looked pristine. The floor was a beautiful hardwood, gleaming in the morning light. There was a 80, I shit you not, 80-inch plasma TV in the living room, playing football on surround sound speakers. From the front door I could see the dining room. It looked like Martha Stewart's Garden of Eden. The kitchen, oh Madone, the kitchen, was heavenly. He actually had cured meat hanging from the rafters, and a beautiful oven that could fit an elephant inside. Pappy noticed my slack-jawed expression, and smiled, in spite of himself. You really expect your old Pappy to live like a crazed coon out here, Tyler? I have 18 different streaming services, boys. Pappy beamed proudly. Why not just get cable at that point, Pappy? I asked genuinely. He scoffed at that, and waved his cane in the air. Ah, Pappy's cane. It was a 3.5-foot long oak beauty. The handle was made of pure silver, carved into the shape of a snarling wolf. Pappy had killed when he was a burly young man, or so he claimed anyway. I remember when we were kids, when he'd come visit us for Christmas. He'd gather us up around the fire and tell stories, the kind you don't usually tell to 8-year-old kids. He'd weave tales of hairy beasts and horned creatures wailing in the woods. He would always warn us to stay away from the woods at night, or the Windies would claim our voice. He would always go on about the Windies, tall, elk-like creatures that walked like a man, yet hungered like a lion. Scared the bejesus out of me when I was young. Now I knew, of course, that Pappy liked to have his fun with us. I'd probably scare my grandkids like that as well. Be a hoot, but I digress. That first night with Pappy was uneventful, save the complaining that I had overcooked dinner. My room, it turned out, was at least twice the size of my studio apartment, and had a router right on the nightstand. It also had a king-sized memory foam mattress. I slept like a baby that night. Or I did anyway, until I realized that my brother had slept in this same room for 5 years. Suddenly I felt ill. I sat up in bed and started to gaze out the window. Pappy's backyard was massive, enough room for a small kickball stadium. There was a clear divide between the yard and the woods, the trees just barely encroaching on the neatly cut grass. Why my grandfather tended the backyard so dearly and not the front is beyond me. I began to stare into the trees, those lumbering husks of wood, hoping to fall asleep once more. I tried to listen to the sounds of crickets and late-night cicadas, until I realized there was none. That struck me as odd. And then I realized there were zero sounds around. No birds, no wind, not even a passing car in the distance. The woods were like an audio dead zone. Shivering a little at the thought, I turned over in my bed and forced myself asleep. Like I said, first night was uneventful. Next morning I drove an hour and a half to find the nearest grocery store and stacked up on about 300 pounds of food. I'm talking fruit, dried fruit, canned beans, the good, sliced cheese, and some good powdered peanut butter. Pappy was less enthused by my dining choices. What is this trash you fill your body with? Boy, you should be out hunting. A real man kills his dinner and hunts his desert, he said with a crooked grin. I ignored his oddly perverse comment at the end there, and kept stacking the cabinets with the food I had bought. Old guy like your pap, still going hunting? I said absent-mindedly. Let me cook you some dinner tonight. I got the good peppers, the good steak. I waved it in his face, like he was a bratty child. Course I go hunting. Once a week. Your brother Jackie went with me. Pappy beamed. There was a glint in his eye. Dare I say pride. Puffed. My brother went hunting with ya, Pappy. He was a stockbroker before he became warden up here anyway. I mumbled that last part under my breath. It took some time, I'll admit it, but boy, your brother was one of the best hunters I had ever seen. His passing hurt me in a way I hadn't been since Yarmutha. There was a sadness now, and I could sympathize. To be 92 years old and outlive your daughter by 20 years has to sting you. Been a long time since Mom, Pappy. You didn't come around much after, I said. Facing him now, I leaned against the pristine marble counter for support. I expected him to avert his eyes in shame. But the old bastard stood his ground. It was that damn husband of hers. He was always no good. Thought he knew better. Forbid me from seeing your... He explained adamantly. My scowl still remained. But I had to grant him that Dad did hate Pappy's guts. While it wouldn't have surprised me if Dad really had tried to stop him from seeing us, I couldn't comprehend the grandfather I remember standing back and taking it. Well, past is past, Pappy. Now what do you want for dinner? Dinner was quiet that night. Pappy didn't even complain about the burnt steak. Then we sat in front of the TV and watched Monster Quest. I went up around 10 p.m. Pappy was still sitting there, almost like he was lost in a deep trance. I collapsed onto my bed, exhausted. I drifted off almost immediately, and I wished to God I had stayed asleep. I smelled it before I heard it. It was a rancid smell, like ancient sulfur mixed with decayed flesh. It was wafting in the air from my open window. I sprung up like a leaf and looked around. It was pitch black in my room, only a faint light from the moon outside. But that smell, God, it stung my eyes. Felt like I was cutting up a sentient onion. I rubbed them awake and stumbled out of bed. When I got up, I heard it then. Tyler. A voice out from the darkness croaked. Tyler. I perked up immediately. It couldn't be right. Richie? I whispered back. My heart clenched up in dreaded excitement. I rushed downstairs half naked and sprinted to the back door. The door was a sliding glass. Motion lights turning on from the outside as I approached. The light was dim. I could just barely see the yard. Giant shadows danced in the darkness, and it took me a second to realize I was staring at the damn trees again. After a moment of looking at the dead silence, I thought I had simply imagined Richie's voice. Tyler. Come out and see me, brother. It was his voice again, from the forest. It was almost a gurgle, like he was choking out the words, but it was him, damn it. I reached for the sliding door, but he stood. I saw him in the casket. His face all. Tyler. He LP me. Help me, Tyler. The voice groaned from the tree line again. I snapped back into insanity and tore the door open. I was about to run across the yard when I felt a warm but stern hand on my shoulder. It broke me out of my stupor, and I saw Pappy standing there, a somber yet angry look on his face. I was about to ask him if he had heard Richie in the forest, but he pointed a bony finger to his lips, shushing me. Then he pointed to the trees. It took me a moment for my eyes to adjust, or maybe I just didn't want to believe what I was seeing. At first all I saw were those giant oaks. Then I looked between them. It must have stood at 9 feet tall at least. It was lean and slender, emitting a god-awful stench. I could barely make out its head. God help me. Its head was the shape of a deer, but larger, almost skull-like. It had massive antlers protruding out of its head. I could hear something else then. A warbling sound of some kind, like a deer, but corrupted, mixed with some kind of reptile. It must have seen me looking at it, and when it discovered I would venture no further, it let out a horrific shriek, like nails scraping the inside of a car muffler. Just as soon as I had seen it, it crept back into its woods. More sounds followed it. I could make out 3 or 4 distinct sounds like the creature I had seen. I just stood there. It was all I could do, not to collapse out of sheer fear. I turned to Pappy, who simply nodded, like he had been expecting them. I stuttered to find the right words to ask him what had just happened, and that old bastard, all he did was smile a toothless grin and say, Windies, boy. There be windies in these woods. I don't remember going back to bed. But I must have. I awoke in a cold sweat, curled in a fetal position, my comforter scrunched around me like a protective cocoon. It must have been a dream, right? That horrific giant. I struggled to get out bed, my head suddenly pounding. I stumbled down the stairs like drunk sailor. The aroma of fresh bacon filled the air, and in my daze I saw Pappy flipping that crispy goodness in the air. He was dressed for the day in fine clothing, standing upright even. He seemed enchanted in his cooking, barely acknowledging me at first. He must have noticed me out of the corner of his eye, because he paused, a grin forming on his face. "Morning, boy. Eat up and get dressed. We have work to do," he said proudly. I blinked at him like a broken wind-up doll. The bacon and eggs he cooked were divine, to say the least. Put my rubbery steak to shame. Pappy ate with gusto, not a care in the word. Meanwhile, I sat stunned and confused beyond belief. I swallowed the last of my eggs and pride, and cleared my throat and asked a burning question. "Pappy, did you also see it last night?" Pappy nodded. "Weren't no dream, boy. I told you there'd be windies out there." He stated this so casually. All those stories you told us as kids, they were real. I was flabbergasted. "You thought me a liar, boy. I ain't tell a lie my whole damn life." "The Grim Reaper would keel over dead before I got caught lying," Pappy proclaimed. He paused, eyeing me. "It's not about believing me. It's about believing yourself. Come on now. Follow me to the basement." He beckoned me, getting up from his seat with a speed one would not expect from an ancient man. I noticed the basement door was already slightly ajar. I blinked, and Pappy was already skipping down the steps. I followed this beckoning enigma of a man down the basement steps. The steps were shag carpet, a relic of a bygone era, if I had ever saw one. I peeked my head out from around the corner and saw 2 leather chairs against a metal stove. I could feel the heat radiating from it, from where I was standing. Above it, hung on the mantel with pride, were several stuffed heads. There were elk, of course, dead-eyed bucks, staring out with glassy stares. There were a few fish of various sizes, a rather large black wolf head with beady yellow eyes, and what the hell was that? There were 3 elk heads mounted in the center. At least I thought they were at first. Their faces were skinless, raw bone, covering their heads like armor plating. They had massive antlers, almost cartoonish in length. They curled and coiled around each other like rotting snakes. Each jagged edge could probably maul me 1,000-fold. Their eyes were hollow. I could tell they were there, though, buried deep in that skull. Their maws were open, revealing rows upon rows of jagged teeth and long feral fangs. I noticed Pappy had plopped himself down on the largest chair and began reclining in it. His eyes darted to the seat across from him, and I limped over to it, more confused than ever. I noticed there were framed photos of Pappy and his hunting buddies. These frayed looks into the past barely caught my eye at first, until I noticed the one on my left. Pappy was holding up a rifle, a shit-eating grin on his face. He was standing defiantly on the body of a hulking beat. Its fur was mangy and spotted, and it had antlers not unlike the ones hanging from the walls. That was a good hunt. Pappy poked his finger towards the photo. Me, Georgie Walker, and Rodney O'Hara took that photo in the Washington State National Park in '75. Pappy beamed. Was Georgie's first hunt of any kind, really. Took a while for me and Rod to show him the ropes, but we taught him well. I mulled over what Pappy was conveying to me here, and then it hit me like a sack of bricks. "Pappy, are you some kind of mons?" I started before I felt the sharp pain of Pappy's cane stabbing me in the knee. "Now don't be putting ridiculous labels on anything, boy. I'm a hunter. Always have been. Sometimes the shit I hunted was just bigger than a bear, and meaner than 7 rabid wolves." Pappy scowled. "How does that happen?" "Whatever you want to call it. It sounds like you were looking for these things," I inquired. Pappy was silent for a moment, a dark expression dwelling on his face. "Suppose it started when I was around 15. My PA took me hunting. Didn't have a whole lot of fancy gear like they do nowadays. Height of buck season, didn't see one all day. Darndest thing, he began. It was dark when we headed back. I had insisted we stay till we killed something. My daddy did like to indulge me. Pappy became misty-eyed at the thought of his dad. I was the first to hear it. That eerie moan echoing in the dark of the wood. It sounded like a dying wail. I was excited. I practically ran to get my head chopped off. My PA stopped me. He held me back. And he listened. The wail continued. And stopped just as suddenly had I started. Then we heard a voice. Pappy was lost in thought. His eyes bore past me as he reminisced. "Help me. Help, I've been shot," a shaky voice had croaked out. My father ordered me back to the truck, and before I could protest, he smacked me across the head and shouted at me once more. Well, I didn't say no to my PA twice, so I sulked back. It was a quick walk, maybe about 5 minutes. We both could have made it, I think. Pappy pondered aloud. His gaze drifted away, a pained expression in his eyes. I leaned in and gently shook his leg. He snapped back and swatted my hand away, grumbling that he was fine. "Damn boy, can't let your pappy remember in peace, can ya?" he droned on. I waited by our old jalopy for what seemed like an eternity. Then a shot rang out. Nearly shat myself. It was so sudden. After that, it was dead quiet again. I called out to my PA. Nothing. I started towards the wood once more, my gun cocked when I heard it. "Robert, Siom here. I need your help." My father's voice was shaky and monotonous. It sounded like a broken record. I stood there frozen, as the bushes in front of me started to move. I could smell something rancid, like it had crawled through the septic tanks of hell itself. Once more it called out to me. "Robert, come here. Rest, now." "Listen to why or fat her," the voice ordered. I could hear malice in its tone now. I raised my gun and told it to stay back. I heard a low grunt, almost like it was mocking me. I was leaning in now, stupefied by Pappy's tale. He was like a young man again. His demeanor wrapped up in passing on this story. As grim as it was, he was almost giddy to tell it. "Did you shoot it, Pappy?" "Get it in one blow?" I asked like a dumb kid would. Pappy bellowed with laughter at this. I started blasting at the woods. Fired about 9 rounds into the brush. Should be dead by all accounts, boy. Pure luck I ended up hitting the thing, Pappy said sheepishly. I heard a cry like a dying orca, and it slumped forward dead on the ground. I had hit it dead center in its throat. Thick black fluid pooled at my feet. It was still twitching. As I inched towards it, it had a skull-like head, antlers jutting out. At least my height. Its skin was leathery and worn. Patches of matted fur spotted it like it had mange. The skull plate reminded me of a fox. Sort of square at the top with a narrow maw. The thing's jaw sported rows of thin teeth covered in dried blood. It turned its foxed face to me, and I could feel whatever eyes it had burned into my soul. I raised my rifle and aimed it at the creature's unholy head. It spoke up once more. "A tar boy, son." My father's voice purred to me right before I blasted the windy back to hell. Pappy let those words hang in the air, an eerie omen smacking me in the face. Pappy looked down. A mournful look crossed over his face. Found my dad deeper into the woods. I won't churn your stomach with the details, but I could barely recognize him. I went for help, taking my daddy's cap with me back to civilization. My mad was besides herself. Of course, took 5 men to get that dead thing into the truck when I came back. We took it back to my parents' farm and burned it, not before I took something from it. He patted his cane affectionately. For the first time in my life, I really studied the thing. It wasn't jagged or anything, but looking at it. Now, I could see where the nubs had been whittled away. I could see how it was shaved down and painted with a fine wood coating that had faded with time. The handle came later, a gift from a friend, but it made a fine walking stick during hikes. Pappy beamed. I could have left it at that. It killed my daddy, and I killed it. But you know what really irks me about the Windies, boy? Pappy asked me. I stared at him blankly. They took his voice. Tyler, his voice. What came out of that thing's mouth was a mockery. My daddy's voice was gruff. It was bombastic even. When he spoke, you know he meant business. That thing took a piece of his soul, and I will never fucking forgive them that. Pappy sputtered at me, the flame of fury burning in his eyes. I nodded my head, taken back by his outburst. I leaned back into my chair as Pappy collected himself. All in all, I think I've killed about 24 Windies since then. Never went looking for them outright. Suppose I just knew where they liked to lurk and got lucky. Made some friends over the years who were like-minded. But frankly, I always thought they were a bit nutty about it. I parted ways with them, kept in touch with one or two of the fellas, and hunted with them once in a while. Could tell you stories, boy. But this ain't the time for running my mouth any longer. Tomorrow night we go after it. Today I teach it a shot. Why would we go after it? I retorted, stunned at his demands. They just don't go away, boy. They linger and tear away at you. Just waiting for your guard to drop, Pappy exclaimed. I was about to protest once more when I finally put it together. A wave of guilt and fear washed over me as I looked Pappy dead in the eye. Why did it have his voice? I demanded, my tone quiet as a church mouse. You know the answer to that already, boy, Pappy replied solemnly, his stony face vacant of pairing my feelings. I mulled his words over and sprung to my feet, leaping over to choke Pappy to death. I was screaming profanity at him when he calmly jabbed the cane into my chest, causing me to fall back to my seat. I coughed up a lung as I tried to repair my crushed chest, and Pappy just looked on. Bitter tears swelled up on my face, but I refused to let him see them. I didn't want him to hunt them. Your brother hunted game with me, and he was damn good at it. Then they came. 4 months ago, they chortled at us at night, egging us on. Richard didn't believe my stories and I tried. Tyler tried to stop him from going out there. Pappy croaked out. His voice was burdened with suffering. He lied and said he wouldn't. I found him in the yard the next morning. He had snuck out. His voice called out to me that evening. Pappy took a deep sigh, like he had unburdened himself enough for the day. You can hate me all ya want, boy. Fact don't change. That thing is still out there making a mockery of his voice. I can't do it alone, Tyler, Pappy pleaded begrudgingly. I just stared at him, struggling to find the words. Finally, I found them. Fine. We go get this thing. And that's it. I don't want to see you ever again. Pappy simply nodded. The rest of the day was uneventful. Pappy set up some cans and bottle in the backyard for some makeshift target practice. I was half tempted to blow him away, but honestly, I would have missed. It had been years since I had held a gun. Pappy and my mum took me and Richard once or twice when we were really little. She would make us wear earmuffs and stand about 10 feet away while she and Pappy searched a clearing for a decent shot. When she was not looking, Pappy snuck us a sip of his lukewarm beer and taught us how to hold a riffle. I remember it weighing about 7 tons, and I could barely get my stance together. Pappy did not get mad at me for that, though. He just smiled and slapped me on the back, saying I would get there someday. Today it was still heavy, but I shifted and postured my shoulders just right as I aimed down the barrel at the bottle of rolling rock about 8 yards away from me. Pappy was to the side of me. No ear protection whatsoever. I held my breath as I steadied my aim and fired. I dropped the gun, the kick almost knocking me over. The bullet whizzed through the air and chipped the top of the bottle. It wobbled slightly, but it remained intact. My face flushed red, and I waited for Pappy to berate me. Instead, he calmly picked up the riffle and offered a crocked grin. He shoved the gun back into my hands and slapped me on the back and simply stated, "You will get there." It took a few hours, but it was like riding a bike. All those childhood tips on how to wield a gun came flooding back, and soon I kept hitting mark after mark. The grass was littered with broken glass, and Pappy beamed with pride. He said my reload time needed work, but I could stay on target like a sumbitch. His words, I tried to subside my anger and bond with the old man. Part of me really did want that. But then, I kept thinking of Richard, the way his face barely held together as he lay in that coffin. The mortician had clearly done the best he could, but those staples barely held together. The story I had been told was boating accident. Frankly, it did not sit right with me then either. Pappy had tried to stop him. I did believe that, but it was him who filled his head with stories. It was him who taught Rich to hunt to begin with, like he was teaching me now. So I shoved the riffle back to him and went towards the house and grumbled something about dinner. We ordered takeout that night. It took about an hour and a half to get there and was freezing cold by the time it got there. But pizza is pizza. So, me and Pappy sat there and ate our slices as best we could. It was like chewing through cardboard at times. But frankly, it was not bad. Pappy mentioned that tomorrow we will be passing a stream. It is a short little stroll into the forest. He said once we passed it, we would officially be in windy territory. I nodded my head and went back to eating. Looking back, I was being childish and should have just spoken to him like a man. I regret that. And at the time I almost swallowed my pride and spoke up when I heard a loud thump coming from the roof. It sounded like something had not so gracefully climbed up there. A warble sound rang out following it. Now me and Pappy were both staring at the ceiling, waiting for further disruption. My brother's voice called out from the yard. Pappy reached under the table, a sword-off materializing from under it. The voice called out again. "Tyler, give him to us. We juiced at wood, ain't him?" My brother crooned. A dark shape took form in the middle of the yard. I could barely see it through the sliding glass. Its antlers massive. It was hunched over on all fours. I could make out two glaring red lights. I assumed were its eyes. They bore into me like a drill. The windy spoke again, repeating its demand. I stood up from the table, fire rising in my chest. "Do not," Pappy commanded with a whisper. I looked to him, and he pointed the gun upwards. My eyes flicked to the ceiling, and I heard scuttling from above. Pappy studied the unseen thing's movements, and aimed his sword off true. When the scuttling stopped, he blasted at the ceiling. I winced at the sound, and heard a creature cry out in pain. It quickly scurried off the roof, and I saw a massive beast crash into the ground and leap away into the darkness. The hunched-over Windy made a low growling sound, and it looked like it was about to pounce right into the house. My heart skipped 1,000 beats a minute as Pap pointed his gun at the glass. "The pack hungers," the Windy called out ominously as it suddenly retreated into the darkness. Those burning crimson eyes, the last bit of the thing to sink into the night. Pappy was unbothered by all this and quietly sank back into the dining room seat and dug back into his meal. I silently joined him, a million questions rushing through my brain. Pappy must have been a mind reader because he spoke up, without looking away from his frozen slop. "These things do not usually hunt in packs. Solitary critters mostly. It is me they want, boy. I sinned against them one too many times, and they want to reap my soul before Father Time can," he calmly explained. "They will not go away even if we kill the one with Richard's voice, will they?" I squeaked. "Probably not. Might back off a tick. But they will keep coming. They will find a way in," he retorted. And that was the end of all dinner conversation. I could not sleep that night. Just kept glancing to the woods, my rifle at my side. The house stank of rancid of filth, and I realized I had not heard any animals for over 2 days. The thought to just abandon my grandfather in the morning did occur to me, but despite it all, I could not do that to him. I owed Richard that much. I stood at the edge of the yard, right when the wild woods crept onto our land. Tall lumbering giants stood in front of me, trees older than the country itself. Pappy was in the house behind me, getting our tools ready. The sky was a lazy orange, the night creeping over us. Pappy said the cover of darkness was actually our ally. The Windies, as I myself have begun to call them, could not see all that good, or so Pappy claimed. He had already sprayed me with what he called musk, a putrid substance, if I had ever smelt one. If I had to guess, it was wolf piss, mixed with about 70 other types of animal urine. I could hear his labored breath behind me, and the tap of his cane on the ground. It was odd. This past week he had still seemed so strong. Now though, on the eve of our first hunt, he seemed so frail, so nervous, so old. I turned and saw he had trimmed his mile-long white beard into a clean jawline. I noticed his attire and spoke up. "Pappy, why the vest?" I motioned to the bright attire he had on. "Only thing more dangerous than a windy is a drunken hunter at night, boy," he loudly exclaimed. I simply nodded my head and turned once more to face the wild. Was I ready for this? To face the creature I saw that night, the thing that spoke with Tommy's voice. I felt a sturdy hand grasp my shoulder. "I appreciate you coming out here with me, boy. I know you still harbor ill towards me, but... well, Richie would have liked you doing this." I remained silent at his praise. A rare occurrence with Pappy. He hobbled past me and effortlessly strolled into the woods. I blinked, and suddenly he had been swallowed whole by it. A voice ran out. "Come on then, boy," it called out to me. I hesitated for only a moment. What if it was one of them, the Windies? I brushed that off quick, however. I took a big breath, like I was about to dive into a 50-meter pool, and stepped into the woods. It was hard to see, though I suppose that is obvious. I was surprised at how much ground we covered. However, after what seemed like 5 minutes, we were already way past the small stream Pappy had shown me yesterday. In my hands I held a rifle. It felt heavy in my hands. I remember going hunting with Pappy and Mom, only once as a kid. I did not hold a gun. Of course, I was only 7 at the time, but I remember that sound it made, that hideous boom, like the earth split open, and the Reaper itself had come from below to claim the soul of that nice buck Mom had shot. I remember its eyes. They were glassy, a nice hazel color, asking me why it had to die. This was personal. This hunt for the creature, it has to be killed. Yet in the back of my mind, I could see that deer on the ground. I was lost in thought, and almost took out Pappy in my tracks. He had come to a dead stop. I was about to ask what, when he held up a hand. The air was silent. Dead silent. I could feel my blood freeze. After a moment it began. There was a low howl, mournful I would say. It became louder, almost like a dying shriek, like an elk being garroted alive. As suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence was followed by a couple of low clicking sounds, almost like the Predator that had been Richie's favorite movie. Could the Windies mimic their victims' thoughts, as well as their voice? No, that is dumb. That was just nerves talking. I needed to tamper down my emotions. Be a lion like Pappy. I could not believe how calm he was now. How determined he was. Was he just a sociopath? Or am I just a coward? I had no time to ponder these thoughts, of course. As that elk-like shriek returned, I could feel that cry run up and down my spine like an Olympic triathlete. It was all I could do not to piss myself in absolute terror. God, what a coward I was. Yet there was Pappy. Cool as ice. He lifted his rifle and scanned the trees for movement. All I could see was darkened bush and pointy shrubs. God, why had I come out there? I was going to get us all killed, torn apart and mimically mocked for eternity. Suddenly Pappy stopped, frozen in motion. I turned my head and saw trees. Just trees. Oaks, pines, whatever the hell they were. I was no botanist. I was an accountant. Damn Pappy. I should never have come here. I should have let the old bastard rot. I should have... Blam. I snapped awake from my treacherous thoughts and saw Pappy's smoking gun. My eyes darted back to the tree line, and my heart sank. Edging out from behind a tree were at least 3-meter-long antlers, curved in heinous directions. I could see the creature's eyes staring at us, red and beady, almost bioluminescent. There was a low hum, almost like a buzzing sound. Was it growling at us? My eyes adjusted to the darkness once more, and I saw the tree it was standing in front of more clearly. Pappy had missed. For a split second I waited for Pappy to try and get another shot off, but he just stood there. In a panic I raised mine to fire at the Windy. The creature leered at me through the tree line. I swear its mouth was watering. The gun went off in my hand, the recoil almost sending me flying. A horrendous mist appeared in the creature's shoulder. As it let out a hurt warble, had I hit it, I felt a loud slap on my back, straightening my coward's spine. That a boy. Hit him again. Pappy crooned. I aimed and fired again. Better prepared for the recoil this time. The shot hit it square in the chest, and the windy snapped back and stood there, bent over frozen like some sort of bizarre cartoon. It quickly snapped back upright, and looked me dead in the eyes as it began to convulse. It dropped down on all fours, looking like a four-legged spider, with how long and frail looking its limbs were. In an instant it darted behind the trees, disappeared into the cover of darkness. I started to shart in my pants until Pappy spoke up. Wait patiently, boy. Let me hear it speak. He calmly reloaded his gun, and I noticed it seemed to be some sort of single-shot rifle. Pappy, you missed. Why? How? Best way to learn to swim is be thrown into the deep end. Face first, Pappy replied. Best way to... Are you fucking insane? I silently screamed at him. Pappy turned to me, a sly grin on his face. He winked at me and spoke, like a fox. At that, suddenly everything was a blur. As something tackled me from the bushes, I slammed into the ground, practically shattering my shoulder. A rancid smell violated me as I was pinned down by the windy. It drooled on me, gooey spittle dribbling towards my gaping mouth. I probably should have closed it in hindsight. The deer-like skull face of it bored into me, like it was studying me. Its mouth cracked open, and it spoke in that familiar tone. Bro, thur. Each help me. You me. Soul zero T me. Whiz, the animal, croaked at me. I could feel my face flush white with terror. Ah, Richie. I began. I failed to get another word out before black blood splattered across my face. There was a rather large gunshot in the windy's head. After a second it slumped over next to me, what's left of its caved-in skull staring at me. They were asking me why. I had not even heard the gun go off, nor did I see Pappy offering his hand to help me up until he berated me. Get up, boy. Come on now. Do not be going pansy on me now, he commanded. I took his hand. My hands, shaking hands, raw and bloody. Steam and viscera covered the area where the thing's head had been. The axe stuck in what was left like Excalibur. I heard Pappy wheezing just a few feet away, snapping me out of my stupor. I rushed over to him and collapsed, taking his frail body into my arms. His eyes were barely open, his breath sick and wet. I could feel how broken his body was in my arms. Tears stung my eyes as I gently shook him and spoke his name. Pappy. Come on, old man. Wake up. Talk to me. Just talk to me. Let me hear you talk, I said to him softly, dread creeping into my tone. His eyes barely opened, but I could feel him looking up at me. He weakly grasped my shoulder, and he pursed his lips. It did not get my voice, boy, he hoarsely whispered. He coughed up a lung afterwards, and I could feel his already weak grip start to fade. You are a good boy, Tyler. I am sorry I dragged you into this like I did. Richie, and your ma. Try not to speak, Pappy. I urged him. We can get help. You can make it out okay. No? Let it end here. Tyler, do not push it. Do not go looking for payback, Pappy pleaded. Let those sleeping dogs lie in the dark where they belong. Promise me, boy. His eyes begged me just as much as his words. The grief and shame of his vendetta overwhelming him in his final moments. I took his hand off my shoulder and gripped it tight. I promise, Pappy. A small smile formed on his face. He nodded his head. Good boy. You always were a good one. His voice drifted off, and he took few final breaths until passed in my arms, still holding my hand until the very last second. The next few hours were a blur. Eventually I found the strength to pull myself away from Pappy and called the cops. I do not know why I called them. I could not think of anyone else who might be able to help. What started as a couple of patrol cars led to a full-blown circus going miles down the road as word spread of the monster massacre. I was bulldozed with questions and remarks about the things, and I could barely get a word in even if I wanted to. Eventually, men in black trucks and fancy suits pulled up. They had hazmat crews tag and bag the fallen Windies. I overheard radio chatter from them, talking in codes and lingo I could barely understand. A man with graying hair and a grim smile saddled up to me at some point. I had just been sitting on the front steps, a blanket thrown half-heartedly across my back by some sympathetic cop. The man wore a dark leather jacket and a black button-down. His cloths reeked of cigars and wine. The man sighed and reached into his pocket, bringing out a pack of Newports. He lightly tapped my shoulder and offered me one. I stared at him blankly, and he just nodded, whisking a cig from the pack and lighting it up. I did not think you would want one, lad. Hell, I barely tolerate it myself nowadays, but today is a mournful one, the man said solemnly. I studied him more closely, his thick Boston accent putting on a hell of a performance. You knew him, did not you? I prodded. The man nodded. My father was closer to him, but I met him a few times, joined him on a hunting trip once. Shot a bear. He was a proud man. Your grandfather, one of the best trackers I have ever known. The man beamed, extending a hand. Call me Terry. I took his hand and shook it, a million questions rattling in my brain. He must have sense as much. So he went off. I will take care of the funeral for the old man. To start with, I owe him the last rites. As for any sort of lingering feelings you might have about what happened here, he began, but I cut him off. He made me promise not to look for more of them. But there has to be. I heard dozens of those things out there. I waved to the forest, illuminated by the array of flashing red and blue. I made a promise. But this all has to mean something. They took so much. Monsters like that. It is all they do. You are probably right. There are more of them out there, more than you can ever comprehend. Terry replied ominously. But honestly, what happened today was a tragedy. Tyler, I am sorry. I was silent once more. Terry took the time to take a long frag from his cigarette. I know what he wanted, but I cannot shake that feeling that I have to do something, you know. I fight back. I finally spoke up. You are talking about your brother. Terry replied. And my mother. Terry was taken back by this, a crushed look in his eyes. He glanced away quickly. Did not know that part. Robert never told me. She was a nice lass, your Maud. You have her eyes, Terry said softly. So, you get it then. Why I have to do this? I was eyeing the men in their black trucks as they loaded the bodies in. They all seemed to be quite calm, considering the number of slain beasts. I had assumed they were feds. But no, maybe they could help me find some closure. Do not be daft, laddie. I heard Terry speak up. You think you want this because you are hurting. And I am sorry, son. I truly am. But you do not want this. Trust me. Yeah, just do not. He bitterly spat. I looked at him. This man who was at least 40 years old. But his eyes looked much older. I could see the streaks of silver and wet that spotted his once black hair, and the bags under his eyes seemed to carry the weight of eternity. What can I do then? I said, defeated. You want my advice, son? Go live. That is what your pappy would have wanted. Find yourself a nice girl and settle down. And forget this nightmare. Honor him by enjoying the life he would have wanted for himself. Terry said, smacking my knee. I mulled over his words as he finished his smoke and got up. He offered a hand and a lift to a nearby motel he was staying at. After a final glance at the men in suits, I took his hand. That was a few years ago now. I know this is a somewhat anticlimactic and even sudden end, but that is all there is to it. We had the funeral a few days afterwards, with Terry performing the service. Nice enough guy. I had dinner with him afterwards, and he told me stories about Pappy and his life in general. Have not seen him since, but I do get Christmas cards. I know you want to hear, I went ahead and started hunting Wendy's anyway. Or some creepy ending, where I hear Pappy's voice calling me from beyond my backyard. But no, I had my brush with evil. And frankly, that was enough for me. I took Pappy and Terry's advice to heart, went back to the city, met someone, and went on with my life. Had our first kid a year ago. We named him Bobby, after the best damn grandfather I ever had. That's it for tonight's stories. But the nightmares never end. If you enjoyed these chilling tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a new upload. Got a scary experience of your own? Share it in the comments. I just might feature it in a future video. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, some things are scarier than they seem in the dark.